Hello and welcome to The Green Room by Deloitte, an award-winning podcast where we explore the topics that matter most in business. I'm Lizzie Elston and this is episode 67 where we ask, are we asking the right questions about AI?
If you want to do something differently, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to at least match the level and ideally raise the bar.
Having a culture, a growth mindset, a culture of openness is really, really critical.
I think it's a fear of what the machines are going to do, which is created by sci-fi and movies for 30, 40 years now.
Everything is derivative of something, even if you're a human being. If you're Shakespeare, you are influenced by Marlowe.
Hello everyone and welcome back to The Green Room. We are back after our Easter break. Ethan, how was your Easter? Did you get lots of Easter eggs?
Yes, ate far too much chocolate, had a fun Easter egg hunt. Maybe in the future it could be AI inspired, which I think brings us on to our topic of the day.
It does, and we'll be talking about that in just a moment. We are very excited about the episodes we've got coming up, in fact, between now and the summer. We'll be talking to some true champions. We're entering festival season, and we'll have some very special guests in this studio for an episode with a twist. Very excited. Can't wait. You can also listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you're listening to this one. There are over 60 other big questions to explore to help fill time before our new episode comes out in 2 weeks' time. Today, though, we're talking about a topic that isn't going anywhere. It feels like it's been around for a long time, and yet it's still in its infancy. And in fact, this isn't our first episode on AI. We did an episode called Can AI Help Us Be More Human? Back at episode 47. And that was a great chat, in fact, where we talked about the differences, didn't we, between AI and Gen AI, as well as topics such as ethical considerations. So anyway, do check out that episode for more background. So today we're looking a little bit in between some of the nuance around AI, because headlines about AI often force us to fit the technology into one of two columns. It's either good or it's bad. It's going to be us or it's going to be the robots. But as with most things in life, it's not that simple. So today we are asking whether it's time to change the conversation about AI to one that's less either or and is instead more open. And we've invited two experts into the studio today to help us answer, are we asking the right questions about AI? Ethan, over to you.
Yep, and as usual, we're joined by two fantastic guests. So we're joined by Sam Everington. Sam is the CEO of Engine by Starling. Starling banks software as a service arm. Welcome, Sam. Thank you for joining us.
It's lovely to be here.
Thanks for joining us. And we're also joined by Isabel Parker. Isabel is a partner in Deloitte Legal, where she's a leader in digital transformation. Welcome, Isabel.
Thank you for having me.
Lovely to have
Thank you very much for joining us as well. So to kick us off, I want to start with a little bit of an icebreaker. So how often do you think about AI, and how much does AI impact your current jobs and your lives at the moment?
It depends very much on the day. If you're anywhere near a consultancy or one of the hyperscaler infrastructure providers, you can't get through a meeting without it coming up now. It seems to be in all of their sales teams. But inside banks, and I spend most of my day dealing with Starling, our own bank, and with lots of other banks around the world, it's not usually the biggest problem facing them. You get to a certain level of the exco and there's an interest in it. What are we doing? Where's Starling going? Where do we see technology going? But actually most of them have got much more basic problems. They're running on infrastructure from the 70s, 80s, 90s. They can't even get a proper view of their customer. They can't process things in real time. So they're a long way from being able to really take advantage of AI. They know they've got to sort the basics first, but they're always keeping an eye on what their competitors might be doing. And I think it's generally in that context that AI comes up.
Interesting. How about you as well?
How much do I think about AI? Pretty much constantly, I have to say. I would classify myself as a bit of a super user, so I use generative AI every day in my personal life and in my professional life. I advise clients on their use of generative AI, and I'm sure you'll agree, Sam, there's so much happening in this space. Every day there's a new story, and just to keep abreast of what the changes are, is a full-time job. So it's our sort of obligation to keep on top of all of that. So I think about it probably too much.
And I think it seeps into our lives in ways that you don't always think about. So every day I listen to Spotify, and my playlist is tailored by AI.
Yeah.
Do you think it's around us more than we realise?
Definitely. In our personal life, think about, I don't know, Face ID on your iPhone, that's AI. Digital assistants like a Siri or an Alexa, that's AI. If you've got teenage kids, they're using AI in Snapchat right now and you probably didn't even know about it. It's absolutely everywhere and in ways that we wouldn't even imagine in our personal lives. And also, and I'm sure we'll get onto this, in industry as well. I mean, life sciences has been using AI for years to help with drug discovery. So it's in our personal life, it's in our professional lives, it's everywhere.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's hidden from us. The obvious uses are the personal assistants, but actually it's all the recommendation engines. Every advert you ever see now is mostly coming off Google's network that's totally enabled by AI. So a lot of it's guiding what we see and how we see it in ways that we're completely unaware of.
So if this is all so interwoven with all aspects of our life, do we spend enough time, do you think, considering how we feel about it? Or do we just sort of accept it's there, or at some level of our consciousness we know it's there, but should we be talking more about how we feel? And what do you think is our general attitude to AI and whether it's even changed over time?
I think it sort of tends to fall into two camps to your introduction. If we feel it's a threat, threatening our job or it's threatening the reputation of our organisation, we tend to react by sort of putting up barriers very quickly, sort of Luddite style. But on the other hand, we do tend to sometimes just blithely allow it to take over our lives without really thinking through the implications. So I think we sort of veer from resisting it to not even really thinking about it. And I think we should be more conscious about the impact it's having on our lives and think more mindfully about how we engage with AI and what the contract is between us, our data, and the machine.
Yeah, I'd agree. There's a real disconnect between what people say when you get them to think about it and ask them questions, and a lot of that is fear-based. The machine's making the wrong decisions, harming someone, taking away the jobs, that kind of thing. But actually, people consume these services every day without thinking about it. It's the same thing we saw with open banking. On surveys, people don't like the idea of sharing their data, but as soon as there's a tiny benefit, a tiny convenience to them from doing so, they do it really happily, very, very freely.
Yes.
And so it's the same. As long as they can see what's in it for themselves, they very quickly become comfortable with the technology and the benefit it brings to a point. There's certain boundaries we're not willing to cross, but most of us use it really comfortably and are quite happy actually with where it's going.
But even the sort of experts, that Sam Altman, for example, who's the founder of OpenAI, he has apparently, reportedly, a notice above his desk that says no one knows what happens next. And that's really quite telling, isn't it? If he's nervous and he's in the public domain expressed to be nervous about what happens next with generative AI, then we all need to be aware of that, I think, and take that into consideration.
Even if it's an awareness that we don't know, at least we're addressing the fact that we don't know it, and then we can have the conversation, I guess.
Whereas I think it's a fear of what the machines are going to do, which is created by sci-fi and movies for 30, 40 years now, whereas actually people aren't concerned about where their data is going and what their data is leading to. What are the data of these models trained on? Some of it's good, some of it is very misleading and problematic for society in all kinds of ways. But people are sharing their data with these models very freely and only really worrying about the physical actions, and very little AI has physical act.
Yes.
And yet that's what, but that's what we're all concerned about. That's what comes to people's mind when they fear AI.
Yes.
They should actually fear their data they handed over to ChatGPT freely, and it can disappear all over the world and be harvested back, and those models are a real source of cyber vulnerability for organisations now.
Yeah.
And I think that's just not understood at all. Well, not widely understood.
Yeah, I think that quote that you mentioned around no one knows what's going to happen next, I think it's interesting because in preparation for this I was reading about this idea of trust and the importance of trust when it comes to AI, and one of the fundamental issues with building trust in AI is it's so hard to explain sometimes how it reaches the decision that it does because of the volume of kind of processes that are going on and the logic that sits behind it, the kind of AI black box. Is that kind of something that you recognise in terms of one of the challenges that we've got when it comes to trusting AI?
I think it's a real issue in financial services because as a regulated firm, you are very responsible for the decisions your firm makes. So you've got to be able to explain and reason them, and that does constrain how it's going to be used. People interact with systems all the time that they don't understand.
Yeah,
Some very bright people write things and decisions happen on their behalf, and they don't really understand why they are the way they are. So I don't think people should be worried about that. Companies need to understand what the machines are doing in their name.
Yeah.
Because if they cause harm, if they hurt customers, cause problems for the business commercially and in the real world, that's going to be a real problem, and you can't sit there to your investors, your shareholders, and be like, well, the machine did it, so we're not responsible for this. You absolutely are.
Yeah.
So that's where the human element comes in as well, isn't it? In terms of how involved, I guess, as a human, we get involved with decisions that AI
In the same way you've got
makes.
to supervise every employee. The machine is almost
Yes.
an employee acting on your behalf. You've got to understand what it's doing and supervise it to an extent, even if humans make decisions on your behalf as an employer too, and sometimes those are bad.
Yes.
So we can't stop the problems, but we do need to supervise appropriately.
And I think part of the challenge is that the accountability for taking responsibility for safe AI seems to be so multi-layered. It's a governmental regulatory issue globally. At a country level, it's a regulatory and legislative issue. It's an issue for organisations like Deloitte who are advising companies on bringing it safely into their environment. It's an issue for executives who are working with it, and it's an issue for individuals working with this AI, building with it, or just using it. How do we use that, do it safely, ethically, in a way that doesn't harm other people? So because it's so multi-layered and sort of atomised as an accountability, it's not really clear yet who's really responsible for getting this right, or maybe we all are.
I think it's quite interesting though that we hold it almost to a different standard as well. When Starling was trying to do things differently, the bar you have to remind people of is it needs to be at least as good as what's there today. If you want to do something differently, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to at least match the level and ideally raise the bar. I think with AI, with machine learning at the moment, we're expecting a perfection that is unrealistic.
Yeah.
The example I always give to people is US roads, something like 43,000 people die every year on American roads. That's a lot of humans making a lot of mistakes with very serious consequences every day, but we have no tolerance for machine-driven cars causing any harm to any human, and yet humans are clearly bad drivers in lots of cases, and we shouldn't expect perfection. The question is, at what point are they safer than a person doing that job, in which case maybe we should be able to put more trust into it.
Oh gosh, and I guess that comes down to trusting the decision that a self-driving vehicle will make, for example, versus the decision that a human would make, right or wrong. You can't explain necessarily a decision that a self-driving car is going to make.
And that's the big question, are we comfortable with that if the outcome to society is better overall? At the moment, no, I don't think most people are. They're happy to deal with the status quo.
But to your point, we also have the risk of drunk drivers, people driving under influence of drugs, people simply not being insured. I mean, there's so many human risks that we have to take into account as well.
Absolutely.
So
we've just learned to accept those, and this is new and therefore hard to comprehend.
And to your point, Isabel, though, I guess with a person, if they run you over, you can point at them and they're responsible, whereas if a car does it through machine learning, where's the accountability? I guess that accountability point is kind of brought to life there.
absolutely. Where do you point the finger of blame? Who picks up, the liability? It's a really huge issue.
So in terms of helping, I suppose, people to accept AI and to start trusting, a couple of things I'd like to explore. One is about sort of cultural change, I guess. For example, in our organisations, about helping everyone to feel more comfortable. And Isabel, you've spoken before about the need for a culture change to adopt more AI, for example, in legal departments. What sort of change do you think needs to happen?
It's, again, very challenging because in a business context, although there are huge productivity gains to be leveraged from using generative AI, and that ought to accelerate the workforce and make them more productive, able to develop faster, able to deliver higher quality product, I think there's always an underlying fear, probably because of the hype in the press, frankly, about is this AI coming for my job? And that's a very difficult question to answer at this stage. There'll definitely be an impact on the workforce, without a doubt. But from a cultural perspective, it's very important to reassure, I'm sure you've had this experience, Sam, reassure your organisation that this is not a question of simply just wiping out half of your workforce. You're using these tools, as with any other productivity tool, to help your people be better. One very good example, I don't know if you've ever seen, there's a study by Harvard Business School and BCG about the impact of generative AI on the workforce. So they did a randomized study. They gave a bunch of consultants access to an LLM type model, ChatGPT type model, and the others didn't have it, and gave them a task to do. Across the board, everyone got better as a result of using the LLM, but the biggest impact was seen in those consultants that were deemed to be underperforming at the beginning of the study. They increased the quality of their output by 43%.
Wow.
So that's an example of AI being used as a real workforce leveler rather than taking away jobs. But again, what's the implications of that? If everyone's on the same level, how do you reward? How do you incentivize? So to go back to your original question, Lizzie, part of the culture change is being able to reassure your workforce that this is going to help them and not just sort of replace them.
Yeah, I'd agree. You have your values as an organisation, and AI is there, should be there to support your workforce to make them more effective and efficient in what they do. Starling's been quite unusual in this case. We made a conscious choice back in 2016 not to have AI, chatbots, IVRs, that kind of thing when you get in touch. Our contact centre is exclusively humans, and you get put straight through to a human the whole time. Because none of us have had good experiences dealing with machines. Yes, they can do some of it, they can do the simple tasks, but they have really non-human results, and particularly in banking, when you're dealing with moments of stress, you're generally phoning banks up because something's gone wrong, you think you're a victim of fraud or something. Those non-human mistakes are really damaging to the brand and to the experience. So we do use these kind of technologies, but we use it to support our people in giving more human support. It makes them more effective, cost effective from a business point of view, but it also allows them to take more time with each customer. We don't have to manage them like units as they often are in a contact centre. We can really empower them to take the time they need to support each customer through the process, because we can support them effectively with the machines instead. But the customer experience is much stronger as a result because they don't get that non-human mistake.
That's so interesting, actually. The idea that it's enabling you to be more human and more relationship driven in your work is another really great point.
It's too often approached as a cost-cutting exercise, and actually you don't need to do that. Use it to make your product and your service better instead.
Yeah,
Really.
but I suppose the counter-argument to that would be the use of hyper-personalisation through AI can actually improve the customer experience quite significantly in a consumer context, for example. So I suppose getting that balance right between where you really need the human touch in moments of crisis, in moments of stress, and where you can just make a customer experience better through using AI that understands their data that they've allowed you to use, and serving them up something that they really want and need.
Back to that, what's your purpose, what's the mission of the organisation, and how do we use the tools available to us to best deliver upon that?
Yeah.
Links back to that point as well around holding AI to a higher standard, that you're conscious that people have a lot less tolerance for those machine mistakes, so make it human. Really interesting.
They're very different mistakes though as well. Humans are off by a bit. Machines are either perfectly accurate or really wildly wrong. And that's very jarring as a customer. When they go off-piste and the model runs out of idea of what to do, it just produces garbage sometimes.
Wow, okay.
Not ideal.
Also interesting that you talked about using AI to kind of augment the human element. And I was just thinking from a kind of skills perspective, because often when you talk about kind of building AI into your workforce and skills, you think about things like programming or learning to be a coder, but actually it sounds like skills of being able to work with the AI and know which bits you need to bring versus what can be kind of augmented or offloaded onto a machine. It seems like maybe they're the kind of skills you want to be looking at as well.
I think that's right, and I'm going to defer to Sam from the technical perspective because I'm not a technologist, but from what we've seen with our technology teams who are working in sort of specific domains like legal, you don't need as a sort of lawyer to be able to code or really understand the technology, but you have to be able to use that deep domain knowledge to support the development of applications that really add value to your area. And without that domain knowledge, the technologists can't do what they need to do. So you need that you need both kind of skill sets working well together, and that kind of translation role of translating between technology and the domain. But that's no different from any other technology implementation, really, is it?
No, I think it's true of all scientific progression over history that menial tasks are slowly automated by machines, so humans have more time to focus on the more complex things. But you've got to learn to use the tools you've got and interact with them appropriately. So yes, I'm a technologist by background, and some bits of coding will get simpler and more automatic, but that's been happening for years. And let's deal with address registers and like assembly language, and nobody programs anywhere near that level now because we've built layers and layers on top that make you much more productive as a person. But technology employment is higher than it's ever been in history. And society's employment is about as high as it's ever been. So yes, we've evolved, but it hasn't actually stopped us all being employed and having a purpose in life.
And I wonder whether it's not so much you're going to need completely new skills as different mindsets, just a bit more openness. Because if people automatically put up barriers and say, I'm not touching that, I'm not using that, it's too risky, I can't verify it, then you do have a problem. But you don't necessarily have to build new skills, although you may need some, but not entirely across the workforce. But having a culture, a growth mindset, a culture of openness is really, really critical and quite hard to do, I would say.
Change is the hardest cultural problem to fix, and nobody likes change in anywhere I've ever worked.
Yeah.
That continues to be true, and all of this progression delivers change in the workplace, and that's uncomfortable for people for a period.
But when they see the productivity benefits, when particular sort of applications are rolled out that really work intuitively, like generative AI really can, the adoption challenge, I think, does start to fall away, because it's much easier to adopt than some of the clunkier, older, more legacy technologies that we've seen in the past.
Yeah, and through all of history, the progression has generally made our lives more comfortable. None of us want to go back to working in the mills in the conditions of Victorian times.
Indeed.
But it's taken a whole series of uncomfortable change to get to sitting in this lovely office now.
I guess, yeah, throughout time there has been fear and wariness of what's to come, hasn't there? But at the same time, just to your point, you won't want to go backwards necessarily either. So it's embracing that change.
Did you know at Deloitte we support social enterprises through our 5 Million Futures programme, like Loaf Catering, part of Now Group in Northern Ireland. They support people with learning difficulties and autism into jobs with a future. If you're based in Belfast, you can now order Loaf's delicious food to go. If you're further afield, just visit loafcatering.com, where you'll find beautiful mugs handmade by Loaf's in-house potter, just like the ones we use here in the green room. Now, back to our topic of the day.
Sam, I wouldn't mind hearing a little bit more about sort of what Starling are doing, because what you're doing is obviously both B2B and B2C, and sort of helping businesses and them to help people trust the technology more. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Starling is doing, or rather what Engine in particular is doing at the moment?
Yeah, so Starling's a very successful UK bank now. I've been there since it was a kind of 20-person startup, so it's been a fascinating journey. And then a couple of years ago, we started to take the technology we built to operate Starling in the UK and license and supply it to other banks in other markets as well. And so we launched a bank in Romania a couple of weeks ago, Salt Bank, which has been a really fun adventure. I never thought I'd get to launch one bank, yet alone multiple now. But to our kind of AI topic, Starling's philosophy has always been to use it to support the customers and to support the staff rather than as a tool to cut costs. So you said, from supporting contact centres through to tools that look at your documents, look at your videos and decide whether they're likely to be accepted, so we can get something from you again while the customer's still in journey. It's all making the customer experience better. We don't do much in the kind of recommendation space yet, but there's lots of processing going on underneath to protect you and to keep your account secure and to help guide you through the processes you want to go. Check imaging is another weird example, taking a photo of a check and getting it to actually be square in the right shape and black and white and things for it to clear through the image screens. Yeah, to read your handwriting and get the numbers off it. There's all kinds of models running over that kind of thing.
Yep.
We do it in a place where you can cope with the error rate, or the human can supervise the work of the machines. Mm-hmm. So check imaging, for a long time, a human would then look and validate the number the machine had interpreted.
Yep.
Makes them more efficient and easier to work through, but you're controlling the risk. I think that's the really important perception for all banks, is their control and risk management businesses. In most industries, you don't have the same control function, and actually that's why AI is quite suitable for financial services, because banks know how to monitor what they're doing almost independently from the team that are doing it. That's what the second line function's for, that's why the controls exist, and so you need the same control environment around, whether it's a human task or a machine delivered task.
Okay, interesting.
And are you finding that regulatory uncertainty currently around AI is holding you back from being able to move as quickly as you'd like? How are you dealing with that complexity?
I think it varies by market. The UK has very strong principle-based supervision, and so you can make reasonable judgment calls against the regulator's principles yourself and decide what's suitable to adopt and what the control environment you need around it is. So I don't think so here. In some other countries we work with, they're much more rules-based regulation. It's very prescriptive on exactly how you do things, and deviating from that's incredibly difficult. The risk is the kind of bias, I think, in the models that you get. They can often get things right, but they're trained on data sets that humanity has created. There is bias in society.
Yep. And
so you end up with very biased models there. I used to work in the auto finance industry, pre-Starling, putting in leasing and loan platforms to them. And a big US auto manufacturer built a kind of lending decisioning model, and they ended up getting a massive fine because they inadvertently built something completely racist, because one of the inputs that went into the model was the zip code. Zip code is a real proxy in America for race, and so they ended up building something that charged you more if you're a person of colour. And so you've got to really monitor the output of the model in all kinds of ways beyond what you think you should need to.
I know this is going off slightly on a tangent, but I've been listening to a podcast recently which gave an example of racial bias in AI. Now, of course, it's not the AI that's biased, it's the data that's been put into the AI, but it gave the example of facial recognition, which has wrongly recognised individuals and charging people with crimes that they didn't commit. But in fact, it is something like 33% more likely to get it wrong if it's a black woman rather than a white man. And that is a huge issue, I think, in the US particularly at the moment, and that's being addressed. But you need the human element to come in over the top of that. Sorry to go off on a tangent, but
it's really important.
Made me think about
what is the control around this, and what is the consequence of the machine making the wrong decision? And that's what you need to focus on as a company, especially.
Yeah.
If the machine gets it wrong, what's the consequence? What's the worst outcome you could be causing?
And also slightly tangentially, but I think it's interesting, those dangerous capabilities within underlying models, which can vary from bias that we talked about at one end, which would be absolutely widespread and atomized throughout if you think about the training data that might have gone into it, right the way through to other kinds of dangerous capabilities like the ability for an LLM to create a cyber attack, to exploit weaknesses in a system and develop code to simply break through it. There is research being done trying to untrain models in that kind of behaviour, which you can sort of see for something like the ability to give instructions for creating a weapon of mass destruction. You can understand how you might be able to isolate that. But bias, that's going to be across pretty much everything we've ever, used to train a model. It'd be very, very challenging to unlearn that. So the responsibility and accountability falls upon organisations to make sure that the outputs, as you said rightly, Sam, are assessed to be unbiased as far as possible.
And what do you think are some of the kind of future or like medium-term changes that we can kind of expect to see in AI, either from a kind of business perspective or a consumer perspective, and what are some of the things we can do to help kind of prepare for that?
What's next? I think, AI agents, I think, are coming for us, and that's AI that
coming for
us, coming to assist us in our everyday lives.
Yes, indeed.
AI agents are models that don't rely on human commands to do stuff, so they can sort of execute autonomously. They could go off and do things in a chain and complete a task all on their own, which on the one hand sounds great, on the other hand sounds a little bit frightening, and again there are lots of governance considerations around there. And then the ultimate last step, I guess, which is either sort of the end goal for AI or the sort of beginning of the end for us, is AGI. So artificial general intelligence, which is where you step away from just having intelligence that mimics a human to a model that can really surpass human intelligence and do all the things that a human can do better, and empathise and reason. And that, I think opinions vary a lot about how far away that is. Some say never, some say decades, some say round the corner, and I think it's very hard to know. But that's obviously, once you get to that stage, we're in new territory, aren't we?
For sure.
Yeah, I think that's still some way off, but we will interact more and more with machines without realising we are. They're becoming more human-like, and they're creating content for the first time. But they are still only really creating content by looking at vast amounts of human creation and replicating the thought process that's gone on. We're not even yet at the point of really original content. Yes, they can stitch images together in videos and fake things in ways we've never seen before, but they're only doing so based off templates they have learned from other people.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because what really is original content?
Yeah.
If you are, everything is derivative of something, even if you're a human being. If you're Shakespeare, you were influenced by Marlowe. I mean, nothing is purely pure, or really original.
To me, it's the kind of quality of it. The things AI produces are fine, but not brilliant. I'm a technologist by background, and so I've been somewhat cynical about marketing for most of my life, I have to admit, because there's a lot of it, like, what value is it really adding? But actually, when you see marketing and branding done really, really well by someone, it has a huge impact. It's incredible. You're like, oh yeah, that's brilliant. I don't think AI is anywhere close to those moments of brilliance where a human does something that's really, really unique, really, really appropriate for purpose. It's good enough, but I've never yet seen it stand out and go, wow, that's
interesting.
Can I give you one example that I think is quite interesting and slightly frightening? So there was some research done recently where they wanted to test the power of a model to persuade a human, as against the power of another human to persuade a human. A human participant was asked to participate in a round of debates with an opponent via a web platform. Their opponent could be one of 4 personas: another human being with personal information about the participant, another human being without personal information about the participant, an LLM with personal information, and an LLM without. And they wanted to test who could be the best persuader. And of the 4 personas, guess who was the best persuader? The LLM with personal information about the other side.
Wow.
And then the LLM without, then the person with, then the person without.
Oh, gosh.
So, yeah. So the ability, when a model is given personal information to persuade and potentially manipulate, that's actually quite frightening. You think about, to our conversation earlier, handing over your personal data to a web platform. If you don't know what you're dealing with on the other side, this could be quite a sort of worrying situation.
Yeah, I think
That's fascinating. So, is that, without wanting to dive exactly into why this is that because humans have inbuilt, well, most humans have inbuilt fear of going too far with somebody else or asking to, whereas, and feelings, in other words, and empathy and all that sort of stuff, whereas the LLMs that you've talked about don't have that disadvantage?
Could well be. I don't know the answer, but it's a great question. I think probably the LLM doesn't have an axe to grind. It doesn't have a view, really. It's just trying to get to an outcome.
Correct.
So it's, like a very narcissistic person. It just wants to get an outcome, and it's just going to do it in the most, the fastest way possible.
It's fascinating. I was having the same thoughts as well. I think that there are boundaries humans aren't willing to cross.
Yes.
That machines don't know. We all have an agenda and a particular moral position we're willing to go to. You find the same things if you do kind of cyber attacks, red teams on organisations. There's certain things that are very effective, but humans and society won't really let you do. Whereas a bad actor or a machine that has no moral compass is going to try those things as well. So I'm not surprised by the outcome, but it's it is worrying for society in many ways. That
it is.
We've all got, most people have a line and the machines don't have that trained in.
And that trust that we were talking about earlier is sort of being eroded by these models in many ways. So if you think about the electoral process and the ability to spam whatever platform you might choose with information that's just going to change people's views. And, we're getting to the stage now we're not going to believe anything unless we see it with our own eyes or hear it with our own ears. Even then. So where's the money to be made here? Maybe it's not in LLMs or banking or consultancy. Maybe it's in somehow being able to put veracity around digital assets and say somehow, yes, I can stand behind the fact that this is true. That's the sort of really rarest commodity in a way.
Yes. Yeah, gosh, frightening.
Anyway,
I've got an ulterior motive. As I'm listening to this, I'm literally in my mind going, must start thinking about future career for my 12-year-old, because all these things we're talking about, this is the future, this is what's coming, and I guess there's a link to education as well. And, our education system still is fairly outdated, I would have suggested, and we still need to be looking at this future. And we talked a little bit about skills, didn't we, before, and the sorts of people that are going to be needed, but it does make you think about the skills and the talent agenda and how not only do we develop that talent, but then how do we attract that talent to our organisations? I don't know if you had a particular view about that.
The national curriculum takes a long time to catch up. And even when I was in school, it was a basic form of IT. It was just using a word processor and using a database. And I learned to code as a teenager because I was an odd child like that. No teacher in the school had any idea how to interpret code. If I submitted that as the work, they literally couldn't mark it.
Do anything.
It clearly did what it was supposed to do and was a good answer, but it was totally beyond the capacity of the education system to assess it.
Yeah.
And I think even now there's very basic coding teaching in school. It's nowhere close to being able to cope with AI and the models that we'll be dealing with in the future. So,
and we can't assume that just because our kids have grown up with AI that they'll be any good at using it, because I don't know about you, I have teenagers and they are worse with technology than I am, because it's also intuitive. They've never had to think about how things work or how to make something work actively.
Yeah.
So I do think there is a real potential skills gap there that we need to address.
Yeah, when you were dealing with a terminal, you had to really think how to get the machine to do your bidding, whereas now it's so obvious a lot of the time, they don't really think about it.
It's absolutely right.
And speaking of kind of being a bit behind the curve, I read in preparation for this that adoption of Gen AI is actually lower in Europe than many of other kind of global regions. Do you think that is a kind of a skills issue, a cultural issue? Is it potentially a regulatory? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do think in a sort of commercial contract with our clients, we're now seeing a high level of interest for the past year or so. We're now seeing it move from education to sort of proper experimentation and into real use cases. So it feels as though industry is starting to really move on this now, and there's been a bit of a tipping point, I would say, since the beginning of this year. I don't know if you've, Sam, had a similar feeling.
People are definitely experimenting with it in the real world and letting it near their production environments for the first time.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, it was in the innovation lab somewhere in a corner and kept well away from the operating financial business. But a lot of banks have some semblance of it deployed somewhere in a real environment now.
Yeah. And as that starts to scale across the workplace, maybe adoption will increase in personal life, or yes, maybe that will be the case. I don't know.
Indeed.
Makes sense.
Isabel, you focus on digital transformation in the legal space, but more broadly, what are organisations doing to embrace AI? And indeed, here at Deloitte, I believe we've obviously rolled out a new system.
Yeah, we're seeing lots of organisations trying to go for a sort of horizontal scaling, which means you rolled out an instance of a kind of ChatGPT type interface to allow your employees to play around safely with the capabilities of that technology. And that's got a really positive impact on adoption. So, for example, at Deloitte, we have a tool called Paired that we use. It's available to all our employees. You can put in data to find out how you can explore the capabilities of what the LLM can offer, just to get people comfortable with the technology and excited about it, because it really can be so transformative when people see that it has an impact, a positive impact on their productivity. And I think other organisations are doing something very similar.
And I guess that's such an important message, isn't it? It's embrace it, experiment, play, get to know what it can do. Don't. If you're a bystander, you're going to miss out.
Completely. And it might sound sort of cheesy, but when I first saw a demonstration of generative AI in earnest, I was really overwhelmed and sort of moved by what this could do for our profession and for our society. I mean, that sounds very grandiose, but it was a sort of very seminal moment for me where I thought this is going to change the world fundamentally and hopefully for the good if we can govern it in the right way. So if you do see it in action, you will be enthusiastic about it, there's no doubt.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and it's such an important point to make, given we've talked a bit about some of the fears, but there are so many amazing positive things. You mentioned the life sciences and healthcare sector, and Ollie, if this is going to help, diagnose diseases earlier or cure diseases, then let's absolutely embrace it.
So we've had a really good conversation so far, and we've touched on things like trust and kind of some of the cultural change that's required to enable us to really embrace AI. I guess, what are some of the key questions that we should be asking about AI, both as consumers of AI and also as businesses that employ AI in our operations?
I think I've almost got the bank answer here of the thinking about the risks. I think we can all see what it can do, and it's good that companies are rolling out tools to allow people to experiment with it, because in the same way companies pretended mobiles didn't exist for years, and employees were just freely doing things in a way the company couldn't see. Instead, if you don't allow them to access these tools in the workplace, they're going to do it anyway. You just won't have any sight of it, and that's bad. You've got to introduce them in a controlled way, and particularly to think about what data is going into it and what the implications of that data going there are now. If you look at the hyperscalers, they all let you train your own company LLMs within your kind of private clouds, and so the data that you fed into it as an organisation doesn't go back into the base LLMs that other people can see and other people might be able to harvest information on. It stays within your organisation, and so there's real thought going into this from the Amazons, the Googles and Microsofts of the world. But as a company, you need to think, what's the risk? What data are we willing to put in? In what circumstances are we happy for employees to use this? And the question I keep going back to, what's the implications of it going wrong if the machine does the wrong thing?
Yeah.
I think absolutely right across all industries that really resonates. And from more a sort of general perspective, in terms of the questions we should be asking about AI, I do think we need to ask ourselves what it means for us as humans, which sounds, very, very sort of highfalutin, but I think it's an important question, because to all the conversations we've had here today, what does AI do better than we can do, and what can we do better than AI can do? What are those real human qualities that AI is never going to be able to replicate, and how do we make the most of them in our workforce? And also to the comments earlier about these LLMs are only trained with our data, it has our biases. What does it tell us about ourselves as human beings, and how can we get the machine to do better things we didn't do very well? Because if we're threatened by AI or sort of disgusted by it, or we think it's evil, it's only holding a mirror up to us. It's trained with our data, our history, our biases. So how do we govern that to stop it, atomizing our biases more broadly, and how do we get it to do a better job than we've done so far?
It's a big question.
Big question.
Yeah, how do we make the most of AI, but then how do we also control the risk, I guess, and make sure we understand the risks?
Yeah.
So it's not something you can ignore. It's like what we've concluded today.
It's here. It's not going away.
But there are those calling for it to be stopped now, aren't there? There are those who are saying, just put a hold on it. They want to advise tech companies just to stop developing any further technology, and let's just get an even place so we understand what's going on, where we're at, before we move on with the next phase.
Yeah.
What is your view of that, or do you think that's almost an impossible ask?
I think it's an impossible ask.
Yeah.
I understand why they're asking it, though, because it does feel like everything is moving very, very quickly, and regulators just aren't able to keep pace, and that is a dangerous space to be moving in. So I understand it, but I think it's almost impossible now that the genie's out of the bottle to rein that in.
Agree, and you can't learn how to manage these things if you're not using them in some circumstances in a controlled way. And if we just stopped in Britain embracing it at all, other countries will, and will ultimately
we lose our competitive.
use it to our detriment. So you've got to be involved in the discussion and forming it and shaping it if we want it to become something good for society.
Yeah.
But again, it is that multi-layered approach. So it's our responsibility as individuals, it's your responsibility as an executive, ours as an advisor, and the regulators and the legislators as well. It's a multi-pronged, multi-layered approach that we have to take here.
Yes.
Yeah. And we've spoken about what some of the questions are that we should be asking of AI. And I guess then to finish and to link to that, we should come back to our question of the day, which is, are we asking the right questions about AI currently?
No. Yes and no. I think we need to focus less on risk. I'm not saying risk isn't important, it's incredibly important, but more, to my mind, on the human side, on what this means for us as humans and how we really capitalise on all the strengths we have as humans working alongside AI. So I'd focus less on the AI and more on our human qualities and how we make sure that we maximise them in an age of AI.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I'd agree. We are looking at the risks, and there's lots of companies focusing on that as well. It's what can it do and how can it help humanity, help make our lives better and support what we do and help us support each other. And that's not getting the same attention as the fear today.
Well, on that note, I hope that you have enjoyed interacting with 3 humans today. Both of you. I personally have really enjoyed it. I hope that podcast hosts aren't going to be generated by AI in future. Do you think we're safe for a little bit longer?
I'm glad we didn't do this virtually, or I wouldn't quite be sure.
But honestly, it's been so interesting, and thank you ever so much for joining us today, Sam and Isabel.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We release a new episode every other Tuesday with another big question, so don't forget to hit follow or subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening or watching. That way you'll be alerted whenever a new episode drops. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad and hosted by Lizzie Elston, Ethan Worth and Annie Wong. Original music by Ali Barrett.